one thing about the 1920s that I've been neglecting: slang. Slang is absolutely a part of the pop culture of a time period and can sometimes give hints as to what life was like then. In this video, I just want to talk about individual slang words and phrases and how to use them correctly. Oftentimes, when trying to reenact or portray a time period, certain slang words are overused or overrepresented. And I want to do my part to introduce real slang that were in mainstream use in the 1920s. Some of the most overrepresented slang from the 1920s are those used by gangsters and criminals. But of course, they made up only a small percentage of the total population. However, with that said, slang in general was mostly only used by certain groups of people, generally young people who are up to date with the trends. And one more thing, most people already know this, but I still want to mention that most of the time, mainstream slang from the 1920s carried over into the following decades and was often still used into the 1940s. So, with all those formalities out of the way, let's get into the words. First, dough. Not dough for baking, of course, but money. This usage of dough can be heard in many popular songs from the 1920s. This slang had been in use for many decades prior, but really became commonplace in the 1920s in America. Because traditionally it was common to earn one's living by making bread, it isn't all that surprising that dough became a word to refer to money. Similarly, bread also became a slang for money as well. Next we have vamp. This meant a woman who was very good at seducing men and casting them under her spell to do what she wants. Not one of the most socially progressive slang words of the 1920s, but it was nonetheless very common in entertainment and media. This word was taken from the type of stock character often used in film in the 1910s and 1920s, who were also referred to as vamps. They lured the main male character and seduced him in order to gain control of him. The most famous vamp actress was Theda Bara, who was a movie sensation in the 1910s, most famously in Cleopatra in 1917. Next is Sheik. A Sheik was a man who was very charming, handsome, and masculine. Really, it just refers to the ideal image of a man at that time. As a bonus, the female equivalent was Sheba, though I personally have not encountered this very often in 1920s media, and it seems that Sheik was far more common. But I thought I would just throw that one in too. This usage of Sheik can be traced back to a specific film. The Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino as the title character, was released in 1921 to massive popularity. Women swooned over Valentino, who was considered by many to be physically irresistible. Sheik originally meant, more specifically, a handsome man on a lustful prowl, as Valentino did in the film, and Sheba was the woman he lusted after. But Sheik soon began to take on the much more general meaning of an attractive man. The film and the subsequent use of Sheik as a slang word were both heavily influenced by the popular fascination with exotic things in the 1920s as well. Next is the exclamation, "and how." Essentially, this just means that you agree with whatever someone else just said. Think of it as a more casual way to say "indeed." "And how" was always used as a response, usually an enthusiastic one. Here's an example using the previous word we just learned. One woman says, "My, he is simply a sheik," and the other woman would reply, "And how." This is a shortened version of the longer response, "And how he is a sheik." The next phrase is more commonly associated with the 1930s, I think, though it was certainly used in the 1920s as well. Putting on the Ritz meant to dress very fancy or fashionably. The Ritz refers to the prestigious and swanky Ritz hotels located in Paris and London, which was where the most illustrious members of high society gathered. This phrase was immortalized in the classic Irving Berlin song, "Puttin' on the Ritz," which was first published in 1929, then used in a famous musical film of the same name starring Fred Astaire in 1930. Similarly, ritzy became commonly used to refer to something fancy, lavish, or elegant. Next is the very old-fashioned sounding ragamuffin. This simply meant a person who looks bedraggled, messy, or dirty. For example, you might refer to Charlie Chaplin's famous tramp character as a ragamuffin. Hobos and delinquents were not uncommon sights in the cities in the 1920s, so calling someone a ragamuffin might imply that they look like a homeless person. The exact origin of this word is not very clear, but it is known that it likely originated in England centuries before the 1920s. Linguistically, the rag part clearly refers to something being ragged or resembling a rag, but the muffin part is a mystery. Next is another not-so-appropriate word for women. Tomato was used to describe a woman who was ready for the picking. Take that as you will, but really, it just referred to a very attractive woman and was used very generally. Even in the context of the 1920s, this word seems pretty lowbrow, and in later media, it was used by many working-class men. For example, in the old-time radio show Duffy's Tavern in the 1940s, the main character, a bartender, used tomato very often, and he certainly was no intellectual.
That shines on your hair bright and fair, from midnight till dawn.
Finally, we've come to a word that might not sound so dated. The phrase wet blanket referred to someone who was a killjoy, a buzzkill, someone who would ruin a lively party. I know I've heard this used in movies made after the 1950s, so this one lasted quite a long time. In case you don't understand what the phrase implies, it was common to use a wet blanket to put out a fire. And fire and hot in 1920s slang meant something fun or energetic. So the wet blanket would dampen or put out the good times that everyone else was having. Here's another very dated sounding word, whoopee. This was most commonly used as making whoopee. This could mean having a really good time or having a really good time, if you know what I mean. Of course, that's one of the most euphemized subjects in most languages, and this was probably the most common way to say it in the 1920s, if you wanted to keep it on the lowdown. This phrase was probably most famously used in the song Makin' Whoopee, which was recorded by many musicians and singers in the 1920s, including Eddie Cantor, Eddie Walters, Paul Whiteman with Bing Crosby, George Olson, and Rudy Valley. Another thing you would really want to keep quiet about in public in the 1920s was alcohol. There were many slang words about drinking at that time, so if you wanted to refer to people or yourself being drunk, you would probably have used fried. Other ways to say drunk might have included smoked, bent, zozzled, and ossified, though I think fried was definitely one of the most commonly used. The reason why there were so many different words for liquor and being drunk was because you wouldn't want to use the same words for too long lest the police should catch on. Even though I said I wouldn't overrepresent gangster or criminal slang too much, I have to include one. If you thought someone was trying to bump you off, you must have been in a load of trouble because that meant someone wanted you dead. To bump off became very common in pulp literature of the time, as well as among real-life gangsters who were caught in a violent feud with a rival mob boss. This also became quite a popular phrase after the advent of talking pictures in the very popular genre of gangster films in the 1930s and 40s. Maybe you remember your grandparents or your parents saying, "I need my cheaters." Or maybe you've even used this before. Most of you probably already know that this refers to glasses. There's really not much to explain about this one. Your eyes aren't good enough by themselves, so you need to cheat a little bit to see better. Another word used throughout the period of the 1920s through the 1940s was hot. But this should not be confused with the other usage of hot, meaning lively, as in hot jazz. The other meaning was stolen. For example, let's say you go to a pawn shop and you want to sell a watch, but the shopkeeper is suspicious of you. He might say, "I don't buy hot watches." Petty crime was widespread throughout the 1920s, especially pickpockets who would strip you of your wallet or jewelry before you even realized it was gone. The 1920s was full of middle and upper class people who wanted to flaunt their wealth through expensive accessories, a perfect jackpot for petty thieves. Continuing with the example from the last word, let's go back to that pawn shop again. The shopkeeper says he doesn't accept hot watches. Maybe you would say, "This watch isn't hot, I just want to hawk it." To hawk something meant simply that you wanted to pawn it for some quick cash. Of course, pawn shops were the first place a petty thief would go once he had claimed his prize, so pawn shop owners had every right to be suspicious, though they usually wouldn't care too much since it was impossible to know if the thing being hawked was hot or not. Okay, let's move away from crime and pawn shops and get back to the fun times. Imagine it's the late 1920s. You're a young adult male. If your friend invites you to a petting party, he would probably be a little bit shocked if you said no. Petting parties were get-togethers of men and women, ranging from small to large groups. At these parties, there would be a lot of petting, which could mean anything from kissing and caressing to, well, whoopee. But maybe it wouldn't have been so crazy if you turned down an offer to a petting party, since your reputation among your family could have been damaged if they found out you were doing such seedy activities. The conservative older generation still would have condemned even the tamest petting parties that consisted of excessive kissing and playful flirting. For this next one, I think most people watching this video now probably know what a bob hairstyle was. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this photo may clear things up. The bob haircut, or the more specific Dutch bob hairstyle, was an iconic style of the 1920s. It symbolized a modern woman who was ready to take on the world and enjoy the pleasures of life, which could vary from person to person, but generally meant parties, dancing, and flirting. Bobbed hair became so associated with flappers that it still conjures up that image even to this day. But like petting parties, the simple act of bobbing your hair could have social consequences, especially when it came to the older generation. For some insight into this possible conflict, I recommend the 1920 short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald titled Bernice Bobs Her Hair.
Every night we're rehearsing the answer you see.
Next is a nonsensical word that probably originated in black communities but spread later on. Having the heebie-jeebies meant that you were shaking or trembling from some kind of negative emotion or feeling like fear or an unknown sickness. Maybe you just watched Nosferatu for the first time and you felt the hairs on your neck stand on end. Yup, you've got a case of the heebie-jeebies. A side note, this phrase was the title of a famous record from 1926 by the legendary jazz cornetist and trumpeter Louis Armstrong. And last, we have the simplest one of all, it. Maybe you've got it, or maybe you don't. But many people certainly thought Clara Bow had it. It meant sex appeal. It had nothing to do with your social standing, or your money, or your talent. If you were attractive and had a playful, likable personality, and naturally exuded sensuality effortlessly, then you had it. This usage of it was popularized in the 1927 film simply called It, starring Clara Bow, who became the poster child for the concept of it. You either have it, or you don't, and that's that. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned some practical slang words and phrases from the 1920s, just in case you really want to act a part at your next 1920s themed event without being over the top. Or maybe because you just like using vintage slang. Whatever your reason, maybe someday you'll be in a situation where you can use some of these words and impress your friends or family. If they think it's interesting, then you're hanging out with the right kind of people. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.
Sweet, sweet stuff, that 6 feet of papa.